You're in a wheelchair, and it's embarrassing, so please don't come to the wedding. What? I mean, if my fiancé finds out I have a disabled family member, it would be so humiliating, don't you think? The words from my sister-in-law, dressed in a wedding gown, left me dumbfounded as I sat in my wheelchair. The reason I began using a wheelchair was due to an accident at a ski resort during college with some friends. That's how I met my husband, George, during rehabilitation. When I learned I would never walk again, I was devastated, and living with the limitations was tough. But during my treatments, I met George, who was a caregiver, and we got married. His sister, Coco, and their mother, Kelly, warmly welcomed me, and I thought I could finally be happy. Do you know how exhausting it was to pretend to be nice to someone like you? Why would you say that? You were so happy for us before. Well, if people found out I was against the marriage because of your disability, that would be bad for my image, wouldn't it? I was still looking for a husband back then. But you defended me against your mother when she opposed our marriage. I told Mom later. I said, you should have handled it better. You need to think about appearances. That's terrible. So all the kindness you showed before was a lie? Coco's sudden change in behavior and her outrageous comments shocked me deeply. Called into the bride's waiting room, I was alone with Coco. Her brother George, my husband, had stepped out, and no staff were around at that moment. Being in a wheelchair, I couldn't just leave the room. I could only look up at Coco, who stood before me, hands on her hips, grinning smugly. Oh, and there's Bill. He's my fiancé. Surely you haven't forgotten him, right? His family is here too, and I can't let them find out there's a disabled person in the family. His relatives are elites, and I come from a respectable family myself. Imagine if they thought there was something wrong with me, too. My condition is from an accident, and we're not even related by blood. That doesn't matter. People don't know that, do they? Honestly, you're so thoughtless. But you were the one who sent me an invitation. Oh, that? I thought this was a good opportunity to teach you some reality. I stared blankly at her, unable to grasp what she was saying. She smirked, grabbed the hem of her wedding dress, and waved it in front of me. This dress? It's from a world-famous designer. It was so hard to get a reservation. Oh, I see. And this venue is used by international celebrities. What was your wedding like, anyway? Some tiny restaurant with mediocre food? I thought that steak was rubber. It was the first time I ate something that tasteless. What a memory. Coco laughed loudly, while I bit my lip. 1 year ago, George and I had our wedding. Due to my condition, we chose a restaurant that was barrier-free, with only close family invited. But I remember clearly how happy I was when everyone said it was a warm and intimate ceremony. I can't believe you even called that a wedding. Mom was embarrassed by it too. Back then, both Coco and Kelly had told me it was lovely. Were they secretly mocking me the entire time? Bill graduated from a prestigious medical school and now works as a doctor at its affiliated hospital. His parents and grandparents are all with him today, and some of his relatives are celebrities and politicians. His family home is magnificent, but now he lives alone in a high-rise in the city. And since I'm about to be a doctor's wife, I quit my job. I guess you couldn't be a housewife, huh? Not with my brother's salary. Being a caregiver is an honorable profession. Honorable, but without money, it doesn't mean much. You have to work too, right? With that body. I work because I enjoy it. And yet you only got the job because of the disability quota. Don't act so proud. They only hired you out of pity. That's not true. Well, someone like you could never be a full-time housewife anyway. But I do think you and my loser brother are perfect for each other. Coco laughed, mocking not only me but also George. The moment I realized that, my shock turned into anger. In truth, George had been somewhat distant from his mother and Coco since moving out. But after we got married, he maintained a basic relationship with them. So, I didn't think much of the distance. Now, I finally understood the reason. How unforgivable. Just as I was about to speak, filled with rising anger, the door opened with a click. Kelly and the groom, Bill, walked in.
Oh my, Molly, are you still here?
Mom, can you believe it? She's still clinging on. Coco and Kelly looked down at me with the same sneering expressions. I was too stunned to care about them, as my gaze shifted to Bill. Could it be? Coco, too focused on mocking me, didn't notice my reaction. Bill just smirked silently, likely not even realizing who I was. Before I could process what was happening, the door opened again.
Molly.
George. George, wearing a suit he rarely wore, had his hair messed up and looked pale with worry. He stood protectively in front of me, glaring at Kelly and Coco.
What are you doing to Molly?
Why don't you at least knock first? So rude. I wasn't doing anything.
Don't lie. A staff member came to tell me something was off. What did you say to Molly?
I was just telling the truth.
Coco, Mom. You haven't changed at all. Enough. We're leaving. Molly, let's go.
Is it okay?
It doesn't matter. Let's just go.
As George pushed my wheelchair toward the door, I glanced at Bill. He still wore that smirk and didn't even glance in my direction. The door was closing, and I was filled with mixed emotions.
I'm sorry, Molly. They've always been like this.
He spoke after a while, once we had left the room and entered the hotel elevator. What do you mean? When I asked again, George gave a bitter smile.
They're obsessed with status and full of prejudice. It got worse after Dad passed 3 years ago. They've always looked down on me for being a caregiver.
So that's why you were distant.
When I married you, I didn't want to introduce them, but I couldn't just cut ties. So I contacted them. Then Coco started acting strangely nice, so I thought maybe things had changed.
He had kept the past hidden from me because he hoped they could all get along again. But now, he realized they hadn't changed at all.
I'm so sorry, Molly. I didn't want you to go through this.
You're not at fault, George. Besides... Actually, haha. I couldn't hold back the laughter bubbling up.
What's so funny?
I know it's rude to say, but Coco and your mom really don't know how to judge people, do they?
Huh? What do you mean?
I have a feeling they're in for a world of trouble soon, haha. Once I started laughing, I couldn't stop. I must have seemed a little off at that moment, but when I saw Bill's face, I had a gut feeling about the misfortune that would soon befall them. Even after we exited the elevator on the first floor, I continued to laugh, leaving George more puzzled than ever. And as it turned out, my intuition was correct. About a month later. Hey, let me in. Please, hide me. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon, just after we had finished lunch, when the doorbell started ringing incessantly. Startled, I went to answer it, and there she was, Coco, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath.
What's this all of a sudden? We said we wouldn't meet again. Go home.
That doesn't matter now. Can't you see? I'm injured. Coco pushed her arm forward, showing a small cut.
It's just a scratch, right? It's not even bleeding.
An injury is an injury. George, why don't you just let her in? If she keeps making a scene at the door, the neighbors will complain.
Fine, but only to the entrance. She's not coming inside.
Despite George's words, Coco barged her way into the living room. George was about to yell, but I signaled for him to stop. I faced Coco instead. It's a nightmare. Bill is the worst man ever. Before we could even ask, Coco launched into her story like a machine gun. According to her, ever since their marriage, Bill hadn't gone to work and had been lazing around at Coco's mother's house. When I asked him why, he just said being a doctor is exhausting or that he rented his apartment out to a friend. He wouldn't give me a straight answer. So when I pushed him for more, he did this. Look. She thrust her arm out again, showing the scratch. Apparently, Bill had pushed her, causing her to fall and get hurt. He shoved me. That's how I got this injury. I had no idea he was such a horrible man. I was tricked. Poor me.
I'll ask, but what about Mom?
She's at home, of course.
You left her in the house with that man. I knew you were terrible, but this is a new low.
No. I left to get help.
Sure. Just like Molly said.
Exactly, right? Wait, what do you mean by that? Coco, I knew from the start that things wouldn't go well for you too. What's that supposed to mean? It was obvious to me from the moment I saw him that Bill wasn't really a doctor. What? Coco's voice grew sharp in disbelief. What are you talking about? Explain. Facing her outburst, I sighed. I didn't owe her an explanation, but it was clear that this conversation wasn't going anywhere unless I gave her the truth. I started speaking, trying to keep my emotions in check. Bill Jonas, 26 years old. He dropped out of college and worked as a host for a while but quit in less than 6 months. After that, he bounced between different women, living off of them. Of course, his doctor story is a complete lie. He never graduated from medical school or even finished university. And that whole apartment in the tower? That's a lie too. His family's wealth? Well, that's the only part that's somewhat true. But him being a doctor or politician? All lies. What? How do you know all that? I just knew. Didn't you find anything suspicious? At the very least, if you were dating, you would have noticed things like the apartment. But he showed me pictures. Look, here. Coco pushed her phone in front of us. Sure enough, there was a picture of Bill in a high-rise apartment. That's probably one of the women he was staying with at the time. What? He likely married you for your money. Your father was wealthy, wasn't he? I heard from George that you inherited quite a bit from him. I'm guessing you paid for the wedding and the dress, right? I was just covering for him temporarily. Bill said he'd pay me back after his studies were done. You're an absolute fool. What? Why do you know all this? Are you trying to deceive me too? I didn't expect to meet that man again either. What? You know Bill? Oh, and by the way, his name isn't Bill. His real name is Jones Carey. Jones Carey? He was my college classmate, and he's the reason my leg is like this. Eek. Coco gasped, unable to hide her surprise. I tried my best to stay calm. We were in the same club in college. When we went skiing, despite my protests, he took me down an advanced slope. I wasn't ready, and I crashed. He left me there, unable to move. That injury never fully healed, and shortly after, he dropped out of school and disappeared. His parents weren't much better. They hired lawyers to make excuses, and in the end, I didn't even get an apology, let alone help with the medical bills. I was emotionally and physically drained and couldn't fight back. When I saw him at your wedding, I was shocked. His parents were there too, acting as if nothing had happened. Why didn't you tell me something so important, you coward? Because I didn't know until that day that your fiancé was him. Shut up. You're his classmate, right? Then do something. Oh, but you seem perfectly fine. You don't need my help. What are you talking about? Why would you need a defective person like me? Handle it yourself. I'm sorry. I'll apologize. Just help me. I don't need your apology. Now, please leave. Wait, you're telling me to go back to that scumbag? Please, I'm begging you. George forcefully pushed the crying Coco out the door. She continued to make a fuss, but...
Keep it up, and I'll call the police.
At last, Coco seemed to give up, sobbing as she walked away. I watched her through the gap in the curtains, letting out a long sigh. Afterward, Coco confronted Bill with the truth and tried to get a divorce, but he flew into a rage and refused. Worse, he stopped working entirely, took money without permission, and started throwing loud parties at the house, which led to complaints from neighbors. Eventually, he got drunk at a bar, started a fight, and was arrested for injuring someone. Coco thought she was finally free, but it wasn't over. Bill had secretly taken out loans in her name. Having already spent most of her inheritance on Bill and the wedding, Coco had little left. In the end, she had to sell her land and home just to pay off the debt. Homeless and jobless, she and her mother lived on the streets for a time. They now stay at a homeless shelter, But Coco's entitled attitude has made her unwelcome even there, and it seems they might not be able to stay much longer. As for us, George used the inheritance he had carefully saved to build a barrier-free house in a peaceful, nature-filled area. After everything we've been through, I just want to live the rest of my life in peace. How did you like today's story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.